Welcome to part 2 of the tutorial on setting up R and connecting it to Tableau. In this second part, we'll be walking through some hands-on exercises within Tableau. These exercises will be focused on time series forecasting, clustering, and sentiment analysis. You can see step-by-step walkthroughs of each exercise from the Tableau plus R tutorial on tablowhq.com. And just click on the hands-on exercises button to get brought right down to exercises. There's 5 exercises in total. Each of these have their introduction, relevant prerequisites that are required for the R server, and the Tableau calculated fields we'll be using. I've also prepared an exercise workbook that's 30 megabytes, and it's packaged, which means all the data we'll be using throughout these 5 exercises is already part of that workbook. So go ahead and download this exercise workbook and open it in Tableau Desktop. And just a reminder, you have to have an R server, so make sure that part 1 has been completed before you start the hands-on exercises. When you first open the package workbook, you'll be greeted with a Calc Fields dashboard. Now this dashboard is meant to contain all of the text that's actually all the calculations we'll be using within this workbook. And each of these calculations correlate back to a given exercise, which you can see at the bottom here, each of which has their own separate tab. I've color coordinated the tabs based upon the R package type we'll be using. The first, we'll be using forecasting, so time series analysis. The second, in the teal, we'll be using clustering. And the last, we'll be using sentiment analysis. So to get things kicked off, let's go ahead and navigate to our first exercise, 1A, Profit Forecast. Make sure that you have the exercise 1A data source selected, as each exercise will be using a unique data source. All right, so we'll be using the forecast package to trend out what data would look like in the future. So let's now go back to the Tableau HQ website to see if there's any prerequisites that we need to take care of before we can move on with this exercise. Okay, we can see right here that we do require the R package called forecast to be installed in order to move forward with this exercise. In order to install an R package, let's first make sure that we're inside of the R environment. Sudo space -i space uppercase R. And now we'll go ahead and install this package called forecast. Install.packages, open parenthesis, single quote, forecast, single quote, and closing parenthesis. Looks good. And now the package for forecast is being installed on our R server. And I'll just go ahead and fast forward this video until the package installation completes. All right, so now that the R package forecast has been installed, let's go back into Tableau and we can begin creating our profit forecast visualization. So quickly, what we're looking to do using R is take the order date, look at the profit, look at the weekly profit as a line chart, and then plot out what the future looks like. Currently, our dataset only contains data up until December 30th, 2018. So using the R package forecast, we're going to populate future values. And Tableau does do this out of the box using their forecasting tool, but it is quite rudimentary. I mean, as you see right here, it's just this giant blob of potentially where these lines could go. Whereas when you're plotting this out using the R package forecast, it'll actually plot those as if it's loading data into the visualization. And you'll see that in just a second. So if you plotted this out, just go ahead and undo, and we'll create a blank canvas again. And now we're going to be creating a calculated field that's going to allow us to extend out our date range by 1 additional year in order to populate that year with data. So if we go back into our Calc Fields dashboard, we have this field called Date Forecast. Go ahead and copy that code. We'll create a new calculated field. We'll call it Date Forecast. Oh, and do make sure that you're in the proper data source. We'll just get out of this. Make sure you're on the profit forecasting, which ties to the first worksheet. Analysis, create calc field. And we have our date forecast calculated field. And what this code here is doing is it's extending 1 additional year onto order date. Like I mentioned before, the current order date only goes until the end of 2018, December 30th to be exact. So we're adding 1 additional year onto the order date, which will put us through 2019. Hit apply and OK. Now if we drag date forecast out onto columns, we see that we have data into 2019. Let's make this weekly. Come on down to the continuous date values and choose the week number, which will allow us to plot week by week what profit looks like. Currently, we aren't plotting anything from a measures perspective. So let's go ahead and add profit to our row shelf. We could see here there's this line that's just stretching outward, and that's because we don't have any data for this range. We added 1 year to our order date field, but currently Tableau is like, hey, I don't know where to pull any profit data from because I have nothing as part of my underlying data source. So we're going to be using an R package forecast to create data for all of this area right here. So let's go back to calculated fields and navigate to the profit forecast code. Go ahead and copy that code and create a new calculated field called profit forecast. And just a brief explanation of what this code is actually doing. We see that the script real function is being called, which is actually invoking that R connection out onto the cloud. We're using the package called forecast. We're inputting data, which is our argument 1, which is this line right here, the average profit. And our argument 2 is our start date value, which is right here. It's defining that time series using the input data, using the start date. And an important thing to mention is the delta T right here, which is the 1 over 52. There's 52 weeks in the year, so week over week, whereas a 1 over 12 would be a month over month view. We'll be using weekly in this exercise. Press apply and OK. Okay, so before we drag out our profit forecast, let's make sure that we actually change the sum of profit to be average profit, because we're using an average in our R profit forecast. All right, so now let's drag out the profit forecast to our row shelf. And this is going to cause an error, and you'll see why in just a second. So R is complaining that the forecast is outside of the bounds of what it's able to process. And this is due to Tableau not having anything to map back, because we're not having the values displayed for this area because it's currently a time gap. So if we come up to the field date forecast, right click, show missing values, Tableau then has the ability to tag back to R all these different forecasted profits. So it's important whenever you're using R and dates to ensure that you have the missing values option selected. And as you can see here, we have our traditional order date that goes up until December 30th, and then it stops. And that's because the order date field only has order dates for these dates. And if you look down here at the profit forecast, which is leveraging the date forecast field, we see that all these dates are still the order date. And then right about here, it shifts and starts using the date forecast field, which is projecting out 1 year from the order date, and then assigning the associated profit forecast. Let's clean this up. We'll create a dual axis chart by right-clicking on our axis, select dual axis, and just to make sure everything's aligned properly, we'll right-click and choose synchronize axis. Next, let's drag our profit forecast before our average profit, because currently we can't see it, it's hiding. All right, so now we can see where the order date ends and our forecasted profit begins. Definitely much more valuable than Tableau's out-of-the-box forecasting. Now we have weekly marks that point out what the profit forecast potentially could be based upon everything we've seen historically in this data set. So we just completed exercise 1A, where we forecasted out the profit. So moving right along to exercise 1B,